The magic damage type has some of the best weapons in the entire game, but it also hosts a plethora of doo-doo trash weapons, and a lot more so than every other elemental damage type, which we have already covered. Now, I have actually played through the game with every single weapon here, or at least have a couple of hours of testing time. Now, this list is going to be ranking all 34 of them based on how well they do perform in PvE, and I'm going to put them in tiers as well because I'm just nice like that. As always, please do keep in mind that my opinions are literally always correct. I'm never wrong. If you disagree with me, that means that you are just incorrect. I'm kidding, just let me know down in the comments. Starting off right at the bottom where it belongs, we have the Ivory Sickle. Now, this weapon is a dagger of which gets terrible scalings. I see in both dexterity and intelligence. And this thing does not get a unique weapon skill, and it cannot be infused nor buffed. It gets stuck with Quickstep, which is just terrible. Doesn't even get a 110 crit multiplier, despite it being a dagger, which is kind of like the only purpose of actually using a dagger in general, because as primary options, they don't really tend to be that good. And this thing, despite it not being able to get infused nor buffed, requires smithing stone, so it's just going to be even worse. And the funny thing is that there's already another dagger that does the exact same thing, but just better. So this thing serves zero purpose. Number 33, we have the Clinging Bone. And now this is a fist-based weapon of which gets that slashing and piercing type moveset, very similar to the Katar. Unfortunately, this one cannot be infused and gets stuck with Lifesteal Fist, which is a non-unique weapon skill. If you just want to use this type of weapon, just literally use the Katar with Lifesteal Fist. It can just do more damage. You can infuse it with other different things. It's more unique. And it probably end up getting better scalings because this thing gets a dexterity and an arcane scaling, but doesn't really get a status effect. And the reason why that's annoying is because you don't really benefit off spells, so there's not much synergy going on with this type of weapon itself, and it barely even gets that much magic damage to begin with. So yeah, the only redeeming factor I can say about this weapon is that it looks cool, and that is it. Number 32, we have the Troll's Knight Sword. Now this weapon is a colossal sword of which gets terrible range, and only gets a D scaling in intelligence, which is just horrendous. It does get that C scaling in both strength and dexterity, which I guess isn't too bad. But the worst thing about this weapon is that you cannot infuse it, you can't buff it, and you get stuck with Troll's Roll, which is like, a problem with the majority of weapons in this game, just not getting unique weapon skills. But the most annoying thing about this is that the enemies that literally wield it get Great Blade Phalanx as a skill. So I don't know why we didn't get a Great Blade Phalanx weapon skill version and put onto this weapon itself. It would have been so much better. But no, we get Troll's Roar instead, which I guess isn't too bad. Troll's Roar can do some nice poise damage. It could still work with a little bit of a buff, but overall it's a very mid weapon. Now, another decent thing about this weapon is that it does get the poking attacks with its heavy attack, which is nice, but the Zweihander also gets that, and it has much more range, and it can infuse it, so you're better off just using that weapon. Number 31, we have the Crystal Knife. Now, I was just talking about how this thing directly outclasses the Ivory Sickle because it gets better scalings, but it's still just doo-doo trash itself because it's a dagger that doesn't get a 110 crit multiplier, and it gets stuck with Quickstep. You cannot infuse it, cannot buff it, so I don't know why it even exists. Plenty of weapons just work like this, and like a majority of the magic-based ones just tend to be like this as well. I don't know why they didn't care to make unique weapon skills for these type of weapons. Why did they even bother designing them? Just at least let us infuse it, I guess? I don't even know. But getting into number 30, pretty much the exact same thing. We have the Crystal Sword instead. It's just a weapon that cannot be infused, cannot be buffed, and it gets stuck with a non-unique skill. In this case, it's Spinning Slash. I don't know why it didn't at least have Square Off. It's just a better skill to have because it's a straight sword, so you can have that on. So it's just very annoying that it gets stuck with that. And its scalings are just terrible. A D scaling in intelligence? Really? C scaling in strength? Come on now. Now, I might as well just continue the trend with number 29 with the Crystal Spear, because this thing is just, it's the exact same thing. Like, the reason I like this one better than the other ones is because it's a spear, because they tend to have better movesets, more range, and piercing damage is pretty nice. And this thing does get at least have a B scaling in dexterity, but still gets that D scaling in intelligence, doesn't get a unique skill, cannot infuse or buff it. Impaling Thrust is very nice. I like to have it alongside spears, but why would I ever want to use this thing when I could just have any other weapon putting Impaling Thrust onto it and actually be able to buff it as well? So I don't get the purpose of it at all. It's stupid. Number 28, we have the Lazuli Glintstone Sword. It's just another straight sword that just gets terrible scalings, gets a non-unique weapon skill, cannot buff it, cannot infuse it at all. Now, Glintstone Pebble, I guess, is not too bad, but the fact that you get a D scaling in intelligence means you can't really improve the damage by that much more. But this thing does actually get a unique heavy attack to where it does have some blocking frames when you're attacking, which I guess is kind of cool. It's very situational. I wouldn't really recommend using it much because it's still a longer animation. So if you actually wanted to get a heavy attack off, regular straight swords just have a quicker animation. And if you actually try to trade out with this thingy, you're going to take a lot of stamina damage in the meantime when blocking with this thing, so it's just stupid. I don't really get the purpose of it. It should have had something way more cool than what it actually is. Number 27, the Carian Knightsword, another magic-based straight-sword that gets a D-scaling in intelligence and a non-unique weapon skill. Oh my goodness. Now this thing gets Carian Grandeur, which I guess is pretty decent. So that's the reason why it's going to get a bit higher than the other ones. It does look really cool as well. It does get that same heavy attack as a Lazuli Glintstone sword that gets that blocking frames, but it's just... I don't care. Number 26. Oh, another one. Another one. Who thought it was a good idea to have 4 magic-based straight swords that all have non-unique weapon skills and have D-scalings in intelligence? Can we trade all of those things? Can we get rid of them and trade it for at least 1 blade-based straight sword? That would be really nice, because we don't have a single one of those. But we have 4 magic straight swords that all have D-scalings. And this thingy is just a regular crystal sword, but it gets Scarlet Rot instead and less damage, because it decided that it needed a trade-off for Scarlet Rot, even though Scarlet Rot's really not that broken. It's not even that good. Like, Frost and Bleed are just way better. And this thing with only a 50 Rot build-up, it's not going to be that amazing. It is cool to proc it, because it does do, like, some nice damage over time. But it's just... come on now. But next up, we might as well just talk about the other one, the Rotten Crystal Spear. Now, the spear itself, I just like it better than a straight sword. Unfortunately, this thing doesn't get Impaling Thrust. It gets Charge Forth instead, which I guess is pretty better for PvP. But in PvE, I'd much rather just have Impaling Thrust. It's just like a lot faster, does some very solid poise damage. So it's kind of annoying how like the regular Crystal Spear gets Impaling Thrust, but this thing gets Charge Forth. But it's even more annoying that it gets a D-scaling in intelligence and a non-unique weapon skill. That's the most annoying thing. Number 24, we have the Onyx Lord's Greatsword. Honestly, at least it actually has a unique skill. It's pretty much just a reskinned version of all the other gravity-based skills that you have in the game, but at least it's somewhat different. Now, this thing is Onyx Lord's Repulsion is its skill, which is basically just directly outclassed by Alabaster's Lord's Pull, because it consumes like almost twice as much FP and doesn't even do that much more damage, and it gets like a longer animation, and I'm pretty sure the range is actually slightly a bit less or about the same, so it's not really that cool to have. Now, this thing does actually get some okay scalings, B scaling both strength and in intelligence. The total overall damage you can get, I guess, is okay, but like the fact that its skill is just like a worse version of something else you actually play with is not going to have much of a purpose. Number 23, Loretta's War Sickle. Now, this thing is a war crime because it doesn't get a unique skill. What else is new? But it gets Loretta's Slash, which obviously already exists. But the most annoying thing is that this weapon is one of the coolest looking weapons in the entire game. And Loretta gets so many different types of attacks, and she literally casts projectiles with her weapon, but when we get the weapon, we don't get none of that cool shit. Why? You could have given like the projectile attack as part of the weapon skill and give it like a unique heavy attack to where it has like that cool bladed effect. I don't know, literally anything, but I guess the reason why it's not going to get a bit lower on the list is because it does get that cool Guardian Sword Spear diagonal swipe moveset, and it gets some pretty decent scalings. It gets a C scaling in all strength, dexterity, and intelligence, so the total overall damage you can get, I guess, is okay, but it's still not that unique, so it's not going to get that much higher. Number 22, we have the Scepter of the All-Knowing. Now, this is a hammer, of which has some very good range. This actually does get the cool poking attack moveset of the hammers as well, with those running heavy attacks and the crouching attacks. But unfortunately, its weapon skill, Knowledge Above All, for 35 FP, you debuff your enemy to make him take 10% more magic and holy base damage, which is not that great. But apparently From Software thought that it was the most broken thing in the world, that they felt the need to have the buff be inflicted upon yourself as well, that you also take 10% more magic and holy damage. Yeah, it's not that broken. Don't know why they felt the need to add a negative side effect. This thing should have at least had a faith and intelligence-based scaling. I don't know why it didn't as well. That's just kind of silly, but it just needs a buff. It's just upsetting because this weapon looks so cool as well, and they just didn't really care to do much with it, just like Gideon, the boss fight itself, just pretty average and shit. So yeah, it's just going to be mid. Number 21, we have the Sword of St Trina. What is this? Another magic-based straight sword that gets a D-scaling in intelligence? That's so unique. At least this thing does get a unique skill and actually have a status effect, hence is actually going to get the B tier itself, because Sleep is actually pretty decent, although against like a lot of enemies it's going to be pretty like useless. You're going to be good against certain types of enemies that can proc sleep onto where they'll like just fall to sleep outright instead of just doing that weird little staggering animation that they actually end up getting, because this weapon doesn't really get that great a damage, and the skill itself only really just helps to proc sleep a little bit faster, still doesn't even do that great a damage as well. So being that it's like pretty situational in how well it actually can perform, it can't get anything higher than this. Number 20, the Meteoric Ore Blade. Cool heavy attack. Yeah, that's about it. If it didn't have that cool heavy attack, I guess it'd probably end up getting like a lower C tier. Even then, the heavy attack isn't really that amazing because katanas already get decent heavy attacks. They get those cool pokes, which actually complement their slashing type light attacks very nicely. So the fact that this thing doesn't really get those poking attacks is kind of unfortunate. I'd probably just rather have that, honestly, instead. But the heavy attacks can actually perform pretty well. It does get okay scalings, C in both strength and intelligence, but unfortunately Gravitas is its weapon skill and you cannot infuse nor buff it. And Gravitas is kind of mid, and the fact that it's not unique is just definitely going to hurt this weapon itself and overall. So yeah, can't get anything higher than a B tier. Number 19, we have the Helphen's Steeple. Now, honestly, this weapon doesn't really serve much of a purpose because the Darkmoon Greatsword exists, which does the exact same thing, but just better. I guess the only reason to use the Helphen Steeple is if you want to look cool or just power stance it alongside the Darkmoon Greatsword because they both get very similar scalings, very similar total overall damage, and both of their weapon skills do actually add frost and more magic damage. But at least for the Darkmoon Greatsword, it already has passive frost onto the weapon before you even buff it, where the Helphen Steeple, it does not. And the Darkmoon Greatsword actually gets free projectile heavy attacks after you use the skill, whereas the Helphen Steeple doesn't get anything cool like that. So yeah, the only use is just to power stance it with a Darkmoon Greatsword, and that is it. Number 18, we have the Family Heads. Now, you guys might be surprised as to how this got into the A tier. Honestly, it's actually really good. I did an entire playthrough only using the weapon skill. It actually fucks shit up, I'm not gonna lie. It actually does perform better than like all the death sorceries as well. Now, unfortunately, it's still a flail, so it's gonna have a dog shit ass moveset, and it only gets a D scaling in intelligence, which is so annoying because its weapon skill scales of intelligence, so you're forced to either go into weapon skill damage or weapon damage itself, which it does get an A scaling in dexterity, which I guess is okay, but the fact that it doesn't really get bleed, the fact that it's a flail is definitely going to hurt it a lot, but honestly, I definitely recommend using it because the weapon skill can actually do a lot of damage. At number 17, we have the Royal Greatsword. Now, this weapon, I have a lot of opinions, honestly, because there's stuff that I really like about it and stuff that I thoroughly despise. Now, starting off with the good is that it's a colossal sword, so it gets an okay moveset. Actually can get some very decent total overall damage with that C scaling in both strength and intelligence. Now, this weapon's skill, Wolf's Assault, for 20 FP, which is pretty good, you do this cool flipping attack that does have a longer animation, but you do get a lot of hyper armor throughout its jumping animation at least, and you come crashing to the ground, and the weapon part itself does actually do decent damage. Actually, half of the damage itself is actually crashing to the ground, and the other half is the ice-based AoE. Now, unfortunately, trying to hit with the weapon itself is actually going to be kind of hard, and if you miss, that's half of your damage already gone. And you have to wait for the follow-up of that AoE to actually come out. So throughout that animation, you can actually get staggered, and that AoE won't even come out. So a lot of the times, you might just do like 0 damage, which is very realistic. But that AoE does actually perform pretty well. It's actually nice, does some nice, okay amount of frost build up. But another annoying thing about this weapon skill is that that is the only way to actually proc frost, is by doing that little AoE attack, because this weapon doesn't get passive frost at all. So very rarely will you actually proc frost with this weapon. Now, I did do an entire playthrough, a challenge run only using this weapon's skill, just to see how well it does perform. It honestly does just mess up the entire game, I'm not gonna lie. But it was very frustrating when like a lot of the attacks just missed, or you got staggered throughout the animation, or like the fact you just never procced frost. So the way I would actually buff this weapon, because it does deserve a buff at least, is to give it passive frost, and to probably just give it more hyper armor throughout an entire animation so you don't get staggered after you actually land on the ground. That would be really cool. Number 16, we have the Fallingstar Beast Jaw. Now, this thing got nerfed way too hard, in my opinion. Basically, this is a colossal weapon, which they tend to have pretty shitty movesets. But this thing, thankfully, does get piercing damage, which is very nice in terms of total overall damage, because those counter hits can come in clutch. This thing, it does get a quality scaling. It does only get a D-scaling in intelligence, but that's still fine. The quality scaling can actually carry a lot, because its weapon skill does actually purely scale off your AR, which is very nice, because it is that gravity-based weapon skill. And for 13 FP, you can just summon a whole bunch of these random-ass meteors that come crashing to the ground, that do some okay damage. They stagger pretty well, but they no longer do that same amount of poise and stance damage. And the poise damage has been nerfed to the point where you're just never going to posture break ever again. But the skill is still pretty decent. It is a projectile that at least staggers, so it kind of works the exact same way as Thunderbolt, but Thunderbolt doesn't even stagger, so it's still going to be a better version of that. And the fact that you get amazing range, piercing damage, and good total overall damage is still definitely deserving of a high A tier. Number 15, we have Alabaster's Lord Sword. Honestly, I thought this thing was going to be a hot pile of garbage until I actually played through with it last week. I did it like a weapon skill only run. It actually performs very well. Now, basically, its skill is the exact same thing as Gravitas, just has much more range, does much more damage, and only consumes like a little bit more FP. It's only 15 FP, and it performs really well. Now, unfortunately, it actually does scale off intelligence and only gets a D scaling in intelligence, but its B scaling in strength is obviously really nice to have. And this thing does actually get a lot of damage with its heavy attacks. For whatever reason, the motion values of its heavy attacks perform just as well as colossal swords, which is absolutely insane. So just spamming the heavy attacks and spamming the weapon skill, which actually does get some very good hyper armor, is just going to be the play. It's just an amazing weapon. Now, the thing stopping it from being an S tier is that descaling in intelligence and the fact that this thing does get pretty poor range for a greatsword, but overall, it's still very good. Number 14, we have the Rosus Axe. Now, this thing is obviously an axe, of which they're probably some of the worst weapon classes in the entire game, but thankfully this thing has a unique weapon skill in Rosus Summons, which summons some skeletons. And actually, they do a very solid amount of damage. Like, I mean, to the point where they can just, like, destroy and melt almost everything in the entire game very quickly, which is very nice. And it's basically, as soon as you use the weapon skill, it's just guaranteed to come out. It doesn't matter if you get staggered or not. And for only 15 FP, it is going to be an amazing skill to have. And it actually does scale off your AR. So you basically just go all into strength. Don't have to worry about your intelligence much. It still gets a C scaling in intelligence, so you actually do benefit somewhat as well. But you can just go all into strength, just spam the weapon skill, and do some nice damage. Now, unfortunately, there are some downsides. One, the skeletons get 0 tracking, so against more mobile enemies and skinnier enemies, there's going to be plenty of times where they just miss. Now, they do have some nice stagger damage, so if you do end up hitting at least with one of those skeletons, they're just going to get stun locked and get hit by all the other skeletons, which is really nice. And it's an axe, so it's going to have a pretty poor moveset, only gets standard damage as well. So those two reasons is going to have it not be an S tier. But it still is a really amazing weapon, and if you can make it work, it can actually end up being one of the better weapons in the game. Getting into the S tier at number 13, we have the Starscourge Greatsword. So yeah, there's going to be 13 S tier weapons. You might think that's too much, but honestly, I've played through the game with every single one of these S tier weapons, and they're definitely deserving to be here because they just make the game incredibly easy. Now, the Starscourge Greatsword is amazing because it's a colossal sword, of which when you two-hand it, you do the power stance combo, which is amazing because you don't have to level up another weapon. You don't really have to worry much about your endurance because it's going to be pretty light to actually use 2 different weapons as well, which is really nice. And this weapon skill, Starcrawler Cry, does ridiculous damage. You get amazing hyper armor, you can suck enemies in, and the big AoE explosion does ridiculous damage. And it does only scale off your AR, which is really nice because it gets a B scaling in strength, it gets a D scaling in intelligence, but you don't got to worry about that at all. Just go all into your strength, and you'll be doing a fuck ton of damage. It actually does get scaled with things like the Raw Medallion as well, with the Raw attack. Now, I guess the only downside I could say about this weapon is that its range isn't really the greatest thing, and its skill for the raw base attack doesn't do that much damage for 20 FP. I think I'd much rather it only consume about 10 or 15 FP. That'd be a lot better, but honestly, it doesn't really need a buff because it's still amazing. It still can destroy everything in the entire game very well. Number 12, we have the Bastard Stars. Who would have thought a flail actually making it to the S tier, but honestly, this thing is built different. Actually, it does perform better than some of the other weapons on this list, but the fact that it's a flail is going to have to maybe bring it down a little bit because the movesets of flails are just terrible. But this thingy, its skill Nebula, for 25 FP, you just do a whole bunch of damage, have really nice range, you get some insane poise damage as well. Now, it's probably not going to be as good as the Wing of Astel version of Nebula, which you can just fire it quicker, probably do more total overall damage and much more posture potential. But this thing does actually have more range and more of a radius, and it can make it better for hit detection. And with that A scaling and intelligence, which the skill actually scales off, thankfully, it just makes it really good. If you doubt what I'm saying, trust me, just go through the game with this. Only spam the weapon skill. I promise you, everything will get destroyed. At number 11, we have the Ruins Greatsword. Now, this is a colossal sword of which gets an S scaling in strength, which is amazing, and its weapon skill, which is Waves of Destruction. For 25 FP, you do an insane gravity attack that is very reminiscent of the Blasphemous Blade weapon skill, Taker's Flame, but the difference being is that this one is just not going to probably be as good. But honestly, the Blasphemous Blade is its own separate league, so you don't really got to worry about that. So it probably is outclassed, but it still has its own specific use because it is like a strength-based weapon. Don't have to really worry about leveling up your other stats, although it does have that 50 strength requirements, which I guess isn't too bad, being that you can just two-hand it to lower the requirements itself. But this thing also does get a pretty cool, unique charged heavy attack to where it leaves like a little AoE aftershock effect. But the fact that its skill does actually go through enemies, do some really good damage, has a nice AoE effect, can be spammed over and over again, it's just going to get an S tier. Number 10, we have the Glintstone Kris. This is just the best dagger in the game, and if anybody tells you otherwise, they are literally just wrong, because this thing is just built different. Now, this thing's skill, Glintstone Dart, is basically the same thing as Glintstone Pebble. So a very quick projectile, quick casting speed, can get some okay damage, but it's just on crack because it can go way further, do more damage, and you can fully charge it as well to just make it go even further than that and do even more damage, which is just amazing. And for only 10 FP, 10 FP and you can do this much damage is just outright ridiculous. And you do get a follow-up attack for only 4 FP. That does have a nice poke, which I guess is cool. Probably better for like more stance damage as well, which is nice. But if you just want to just melt enemies, the play is to just keep spamming the projectile over and over again. And this thing also gets 110 crit multiplier, which is really nice, and actually gets some very good scalings, as C in both dexterity and intelligence. So there's literally nothing bad about this weapon, other than the fact that maybe it's a dagger, which you probably don't really want to use as a primary option, but the projectiles are just going to carry it either way, and it looks really cool as well. Number 9, we have the Clayman's Harpoon. Now, this is a magic-based spear of which you actually can infuse, which is very unique because normally stuff that already has an intelligence-based scaling and split magic damage cannot be infused, but this thing can. So that means if you actually have it magic infused, it gets doubled down into the intelligence scaling to just make it perform incredibly well, to the point where like you just do a lot of damage with a magic infusion. You pair it alongside certain types of magic based skills, like Ice Spear being my favorite one to pair it alongside because you can just do ridiculous damage, good frost build up, or pair it along something like the Glint Blade Phalanx, which also does very good stance damage. So you can just pair it alongside all different types of magic based skills, and the fact that it's a spear means it gets a very solid moveset on top of that. You can get 2 of these bad boys because you can just farm them and then power stance them both and end up having one of the better builds in the entire game because it does just perform that well. Number 8, we have the Moonveil Katana. Now, this thing is just a very good weapon. It just does everything just very well. It's a katana, so it gets an amazing moveset, gets inherent bleed. Its scalings is a B in both dexterity and intelligence, which is amazing, so it's good for total overall damage. And its weapon skill is just a reskinned version of Unsheath. And Unsheath is already one of the best skills in the entire game, but this thing just turns it into a projectile. And it's actually a very quick projectile that can go very far and just do amazing damage. So, like, it's obviously the recipe for success. I guess the only downside is that it does consume a lot more FP compared to Unsheath, but it still doesn't even make a difference. It's still, like, amazing. It can still cheese the entire game incredibly well. It's just an amazing weapon. Now, at number 7 and number 6, I want to talk about them at the exact same time because the Marius Executioner Sword and the Regalia both work the exact same way with their weapon skills. It's like some cool corkscrew attack that can hit multiple times and do a lot of damage, especially when you pair it with the correct types of talismans like the Godfrey's Icon and Millicent Prosthesis. Now, the Regalia I tend to prefer it a little bit more, even though the Greatsword might actually have some more damage and more range. But the reason being is that straight swords are quicker, so if you actually power stance them, you can actually proc the multi-hit talismans a lot faster than actually use the weapon skill, and just probably end up doing more damage that way. So that's the reason, but they're both incredibly good. They can both cheese the entire game very quickly and do a lot of damage. Like, I mean, ridiculous amounts of damage they can do if you actually have them correctly min-maxed. Now, obviously, it's going to involve being a lot more closer range. Something like the Moonveil Katana is probably going to perform better in terms of putting it in the hands of a casual, because anybody can succeed with that weapon, but this thing is going to require more specific types of builds and more specific types of playstyles with, I guess, a little bit more skill, but it's still going to be an amazing weapon. At number 5, we have the Sword of Night and Flame. Now, I did talk about this weapon in my fire ranking video, but I talked about the fire portion of this. Now I'm going to talk about the magic portion, which I actually prefer a little bit more because it consumes less FP, it goes further, and actually can just do a lot more damage if you pair it alongside things like the Spellblade set and Terra Magica. And honestly, when I did a playthrough with this weapon, I thought it was going to be kind of average, because I had the impression that you had to go into one particular stat for it to actually be really good and really benefit off of that way, which obviously does hurt the total overall damage you could do with the weapon itself, which is not really that beneficial, but no, you don't even need that much stat investment to really benefit off it. I had about 30 intelligence, and I was still fucking up enemies that were like mid to late game very easily. It was just that good of a weapon to have. At number 4, we have the Death Ritual Spear. You guys need to stop sleeping on my guy. This thing is so damn good. So this thing is a spear, which means it gets a very solid moveset. Its heavy attacks are actually also unique, which they're horizontal swipes, which is very nice and complementary to spears themselves. But this thing's skill, for 20 FP Spear Call Ritual, rains a whole bunch of spears from the sky that does insane damage. Even if they're smaller, larger enemies, doesn't even matter. They're still really good. And actually does some decent poise and stagger damage as well. And it pairs alongside nicely with its critical damage, which it gets 110 crit multiplier. So after you get the poise break, you can just use the riposte and just end up doing even more damage. Now, the downside is that this thing does get a descaling in intelligence, which it does scale up intelligence, which is really annoying. But Just go into intelligence either way. Go all into that bitch. Keep spamming the weapon skill. It performs just as well as kind of like what the old Fallingstar Beast Jaw used to be. But it'll probably end up just doing more damage. Not as good poise damage, but the damage itself, total overall damage, cannot be understated. It's just really that good. Number 3, we have the Wing of Astel. Now, this thing is basically like the best poise-breaking machine in the entire game, and it's a curved sword. I don't know how they let this happen, but they did. Now, this weapon's skill, Nebula, for 20 FP, does this cool little short-range AoE attack that you can spam over and over again. Does some very solid damage, it staggers very well, but the poise damage is just straight up ridiculous, especially if you hit with all 3 portions of its skill itself. And its heavy attack, when fully charged, does more poise damage than colossal weapons. It's ridiculous, and it's a projectile. How do you have insane poise damage and have a projectile and do good total overall damage and have your weapon skill also get insane poise damage? It is the best poise breaking weapon in the entire game, and it's not even close. And it gets a B scaling in intelligence and a C scaling in dexterity. It's just amazing. It's amazing. At number 2, we have the Death's Poker. Now, this weapon is a greatsword of which gets passive frost, and this thing's weapon skill is just absolutely ridiculous because Ghost Flame Ignition for 15 FP, you summon this little Ghost Flame Ball that does actually do some decent damage, can actually proc frost very quickly, and you can actually do a follow-up input for both your light and your heavy attack. You can click R1 to fuck shit up, or you can click R2 to fuck shit up as well. It doesn't really matter which one you click because they're both going to do ridiculous damage. They're just that good. Now, this weapon also does get a B scaling in dexterity. It only gets a D scaling in intelligence, but actually does scale pretty well despite that D scaling. I think it scales better with that D scaling in intelligence compared to the C scaling that it gets in strength. But either way, it's still really amazing. Doesn't even matter because you just go into that intelligence stat and just end up melting everything in the entire game and proccing frost on top of that extremely quickly. This thing also does get a pretty unique heavy attack. Gets a cool little like lunge, which I guess is kind of cool, but it doesn't even matter because you're just going to be spamming the weapon skill the entire time because it's just that good. Number 1, we have the Darkmoon Greatsword, and to what I consider probably the best weapon in the entire game. This thing is a greatsword of which gets passive frost, to which its weapon skill, Moonlight Greatsword, buffs the weapon with more frost damage, more magic damage, and actually turns your heavy attacks into projectiles, which obviously doesn't consume any FP. So you can just fully charge your heavy attacks, do a pretty decently ranged projectile that has a nice little AoE or horizontal spread, so actually is good against enemies that like to dodge around, do ridiculous damage, and ridiculous frost build up as well, to the point where it's like, it's just cheating. Like, how can you get a free projectile attack that does that much damage, 35 stance damage, ridiculous frost build up? Like, what? Like, at a distance. It's not doing it at close fucking range. It's doing it at a motherfucking distance. How? Anyway, that's that. We're done. As always, please do like and subscribe because I do have some more ranking videos coming along the way. And do follow me on Twitch as well because I will be live every single day doing challenge runs. The link will be down below.